Imagine you're a buyer being shown a home. You've decided it's the perfect home for your family. Would you want to know if it had been flooded or if it had been a fire in the past? Would you expect your real estate licensee to tell you if they knew? What if there were some weird or strange rules that you didn't know about that governed what they could tell you? What if their ability to tell you depended on the color of the hat they were wearing, and you had to pick the color of the hat you wanted them to wear? If the hat color choices were red versus green or white versus black, you might have a clue. But what if their hat was blue or yellow? Would you know which color to pick? Being represented in Alabama by a licensee is kind of like that. In 1910, Alabama decided all real estate licensees would wear the same color hat. Every real estate salesperson would represent the seller. No one could represent the buyer. Oh, and buyers should beware. The rule of law would be caveat emptor, which is Latin for buyer beware. It wasn't until 1995 that the Alabama legislature passed a new law changing up how licensees could represent buyers and sellers, and for the first time, buyers could be represented. Under the new law, buyers and sellers could pick the form of representation they receive from a real estate licensee. Or in other words, you choose the color of the hat that your salesperson is wearing. And what the licensee can disclose to you depends on the color of the hat they're wearing. The state of Alabama wants you to know how you can be represented as soon as reasonably possible and before the exchange of confidential information. The 1995 Alabama law requires me to provide you with a written disclosure form that describes these different types of representation. The image on the screen is of that disclosure form. You are encouraged to read and sign this disclosure form when it is presented by me. Your signature simply acknowledges that you have been shown this form. It does not bind you to anything. I am required to keep a copy of this form to prove, when audited by the state, that you were advised as to how you could be represented. After this disclosure, you may then choose the type of brokerage agreement best suited to your needs. Until a written brokerage agreement is assigned, a transaction brokerage relationship will be in effect. There are basically 4 types of real estate brokerage relationships that can be established between the consumer and the real estate licensee. 1, single agency; 2, limited consent dual agency; 3, sub-agency; and 4, transactional brokerage. And they all fall into 2 basic categories of representation: represented under agency and not represented under agency and transaction brokerage. Services rendered by all licensees. Alabama law imposes the following obligations on all real estate licensees, to all parties, regardless of relationship. 1, to provide services honestly and in good faith. 2, to exercise reasonable care and skill. 3, to keep confidential any information gained in confidence, unless disclosure is required by law or by duty to a client. The information becomes public knowledge or disclosure is authorized in writing. To present all written offers promptly to the seller. To answer your questions completely and accurately. Even if you're working with a licensee who is not your agent, there are many things they can do to assist you, such as provide information about properties, show properties, assist in making a written offer, provide information on financing. So regardless of your decision to be represented or not, you can complete the purchase of your sale of your home with either agency or transaction brokerage. Agency must be created by a signed written document. If you do not sign an agreement, by law, the licensee working with you is a transaction broker. The transactional broker assists 1 or more parties who are customers in a contemplated real estate transaction. Without being an agent, fiduciary, or advocate of any party to the transaction. The licensee, acting as a transactional broker, must provide brokerage services to all parties, both sellers and buyers, and avoid showing favoritism to either buyer or seller. This means that they act as an intermediary between the buyers and the sellers. Their basic function is to bring buyers and sellers together so that a real estate sale can be completed. The transactional broker may not volunteer information pertinent to the transaction or render any agency services, including doing anything that might be considered representing you. They may respond to direct questions. They can provide you with facts. They may not render opinions, analyze, advise, negotiate, or advocate. One way to think of it is, they do not represent a person. They represent a deal, the piece of paper, if you will. An agent is a person who acts for or represents you in negotiations with other parties. A client is the person the agent represents. The licensee, when acting as an agent, must loyally represent the best interest of the client by placing the interest of the client ahead of the interest of any other party. The agent is required to disclose any information they have regarding the property being considered. The agent is obligated to negotiate the best price and terms for his clients. Single agency is created by a signed written agreement. Each real estate company has its own buyer brokerage agreement form, which typically has a term, statement of services to be provided, an agreement to exclusively work with the licensee, and a statement of fees charged. Normally, a buyer-broker agreement can be terminated in writing at any time. The intent of the 1995 law was to provide two paths toward representation. One, called transactional brokerage, was for sophisticated persons who wanted real estate services but not representation. An agency for those seeking representation in addition to services. The idea behind both was that term, services provided, and fees charged would be agreed between the parties and be in writing. What happens in real life is somewhat different. In Baldwin County, probably 99.9% of all properties listed are done so on a form provided by the local board of realtors that incorporates exclusive single agency. So almost every seller is covered by single agency. On the buyer side, because the default is transactional brokerage arrangement, about 70% of buyers end up outside of single agency. And I think this is a problem because you, as the customer, believe that the licensee helping you is representing you. But if they're a transactional broker, they're not. They're representing the deal. As the customer, you expect the salesperson to tell you anything they know that is bad about the property you're considering. But by law, the transactional broker can't because they're forbidden to disclose unless asked. They can only respond to questions. And the awful part is they didn't tell you that they couldn't by law. I guess somehow you were supposed to just know this. So why are only 30% of buyers represented in single agency? Well, because many brokers prefer single transactional brokerage because they believe they have less personal liability. And after disclosing that a single agency relationship can exist, they never get around to presenting a buyer-broker agency agreement for the customer to sign. And others never present the buyer-broker agency agreement because it asks for exclusivity from the buyer. And the licensee, desperate for a commission check, is afraid that they will lose the prospect if they ask for exclusivity. And again, the customer is denied representation. But the biggest problem is, and this is where I get up on my soapbox, the problem is buyer beware is the law, and the buyer absolutely needs disclosure of everything the licensee knows or the problems they see which might affect the sale. One night in 2014, we had a 17-inch rain. Fast forward a couple years, I was showing houses to a couple from Memphis. They didn't know anything about our area. They wanted at least a 1-acre lot. He preferred one that backed up to a field. She preferred one in a subdivision. I knew about the subdivision she was interested in. I knew it was on a slope, and the lots at the bottom of the slope back up to the Magnolia River. I also knew that the house that backed up to the Magnolia River had sustained 4 feet of flooding in that 17-inch rain. I was able to disclose what I knew about the flooding because they had signed a buyer brokerage agreement with me, and I was representing them in single agency. If they hadn't, and if I was serving them as a transactional broker, and if they didn't ask me the direct question about flooding, I was prohibited by law from disclosing the fact of flooding. Buyers have enough problems caused by our buyer beware law. Don't add to your problems by choosing a transactional brokerage arrangement. That's the end of my soapbox speech. The third form of representation is limited consensual dual agency. It's a form of agency relationship where the real estate brokerage company represents both the buyer and the seller in the same real estate transaction. Consensual dual agency requires the licensee to obtain the written consent of both the buyer and the seller to act as their agent. The two most common circumstances where dual agency is encountered are, first, when 2 or more licensees under the same broker each represent a different party to the transaction, and second, when one licensee represents both the buyer, seller in the same sales transaction. With this type of transaction, salespeople with the brokerage having the listing can show the houses of owners that they represent as agents to their buyer clients. In the case of dual agency, the principal function is the licensee is to help both parties reach a mutually satisfactory outcome to their negotiations. The dual agent must avoid showing favoritism to either party and refrain from revealing confidential information that could prove detrimental to one side or the other. Although buyers and sellers may not benefit from the full range of services or agent loyalty that could otherwise be provided with a single agency arrangement, consensual dual agency does offer consumers more assistance and guidance than they would be possible under a transactional brokerage arrangement. The fourth form of representation is subagency. Subagents are empowered to act for another broker in performing real estate services for that broker. This form of representation, while available, is rare in Baldwin County. It is not offered by my broker. The key points to remember are: who is represented? Under single agency, the buyer or the seller is represented. You are a client. The agent must disclose everything he knows that is pertinent to the sale. Under limited consent dual agency, both the buyer and the seller are represented. Under transactional brokerage arrangement, neither the buyer or the seller is represented. You are a customer, not a client. You may ask the transactional broker any question and expect a truthful reply. They may respond to direct questions. They can provide you with facts. They may not render opinions, analyze, advise, negotiate, or advocate. Remember, if you do not sign an agency agreement, by law, the licensee working with you will be considered a transactional broker, and what can or cannot be disclosed to you matters because Alabama is a buyer beware state and you need all the help you can get. I personally strongly urge you to seek single agency representation. I don't require a new customer to sign a buyer's agency agreement when we first meet, because that's a little bit like asking someone to marry you on the first date. You may want to get to know me better before you decide to enter into an agency relationship. If you are a buyer and you want to wait until you need advice, opinion, advocacy, or negotiating before entering into a single agency relationship, just remember not to share anything you wouldn't want shared with the seller by the transactional broker. Because if he shows you property that his broker has an agency relationship with, the transactional broker is now representing the seller. Watch my video, Single Agency versus Transactional Brokerage, to learn more specific examples of why I think you need single agency representation under buyer beware. Thank you for watching this video. Please comment below to share your thoughts and experiences with others, and like or subscribe to my channel if you want to know more about what's happening in real estate in Baldwin County. I'm Tom Ball, a local realtor in Baldwin County. Reach out to me if you have any questions on how you can be represented or anything else. Thank you.